right, our next speaker, I'm going to have Dr. Jeremiah come up and introduce him. So here we go. Here's Dr. Jeremiah.
All right. Kind of tall. Everybody hear me okay? Awesome. So my name is Jeremiah Eisenchenk. I'm a family medicine and hospital medicine doctor in Brainerd, and I have a particular interest in nutrition and wellness. And really have to say I'm super energized and inspired by, super excited and energized and inspired by everybody showing up here today. Sort of started this process a year ago with some interested providers in our community, and I guess figured this would happen someday, but never quite this soon, so this is pretty cool. So I'm introducing Dr. Mark Berger, who's our next presenter. Dr. Berger completed his medical school training at the University of Minnesota. He then served in the Navy for 4 years, including a 6-month service in the Gulf Storm operation in Saudi Arabia, caring for Marines. He then went to Mayo and did a 4-year residency in diagnostic radiology, followed by a fellowship at Duke in body imaging. He's been practicing radiology in St. Paul for the last 20 years. Radiology is a fascinating field. It's pretty cool that, nowadays we can see into the human body, and that's what Dr. Berger does every day, looking at images and interpreting disease states. And over the course of his practice, he noticed he was seeing things that weren't there so often before, and he'll talk about them here, but all the things Dr. Park sort of mentioned, increased fat mass and liver dysfunction, things that, were previously kind of rare when he first started practicing. So this led him to kind of wonder why are these things happening, even though people are following the standard recommended medical and nutritional, guidelines. This was puzzling to him. So he had his own transformation with his own wellness and lifestyle, and thought, I've got to learn more about this. I'm going to kind of take this to another level, and he ultimately got a 2-year degree from Arizona in integrative medicine, and now his focus, in addition to being a radiologist, is practicing what he'll talk about, a healthy nutritional state, wellness, and functional medicine, and he has some additional education in those fields as well. So he's now committed to helping communities, patients, his family, eat this way and live a healthier, more balanced life. He's married to Daria, who's here as well. They have 2 kids, and they live in Afton, Minnesota, and I'm excited to welcome Dr. Berger. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you, Zach, for putting on this wonderful conference. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So here we go. What to eat? Let's see. Let's start off with this. So what to eat in low carb in a high carb world? So this is a question we ask every day, every meal, every mouth bite. What's it going to be? Okay? And it's become a challenging question to answer because we have gotten a lot of conflicting and contradictory information on what constitutes a healthy meal. Dietary guidelines provided by our government and nutritional authorities over the last 50 years have pretty much led us and contributed to the chronic disease that those very recommendations were supposed to help us treat. So we're going to look at some different options today. We're going to kind of look at where we are now. We're going to see how we got there, a little glimpse into the history of this low-fat theory. We're going to see what changes we need to make, and then I'm going to offer some suggestions on healthier options. The second lecture is going to be taking a look at what this appears like on imaging. So that's what we're going to be doing the rest of the morning and this early afternoon. Much of what you're going to hear today, you have not heard from your doctor or perhaps your neighbors or even on nightly news, okay? That's okay. Keep an open mind. This is intentional. This is to get you kind of stirred and out of your comfort place. And Dr. Parks gave a great intro on kind of what we're going to be focusing on. Okay, so here we are. We talked about some of this already. 2/3 of the U.S. adult population is overweight, and 1/3 of us are obese. We now have 15% of our kids are overweight. 30 million Americans now with diabetes, 2015. Look at this next stack, 193,000 U.S. kids under 20 with diabetes. If you go back 40 years ago and you had a child with type 2 diabetes, you could submit that to a journal and have it published because it was so unique. We now see these every day. And this has happened in 40 years. 327 billion. This will bankrupt most countries, this whole diabetes epidemic. This is not confined to the US. This is really getting to be a problem throughout the world. Okay, so this is from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And as this diabetes thing and obesity thing became more and more prevalent, the government took notice and said, you know, we got to start tracking this. You know, what is happening? Where is this coming from? And can we do anything about it? So this is what it looked like in 1985. And the white is pretty much either under 10% or we didn't have data for it. The light blue is this less than 10% obesity, and the darker areas are 10 to 14%. And they're just defining obesity as a BMI or body mass index of greater than 30. And we're going to be talking about BMI more in the next lecture. But that's what they're defining obesity. So this is where we're starting in 1985. Okay, here we are in 1991. Now we got a new category. Okay, 50 to 90%, a few states. Okay, and we're losing the white. Got a few states still in the white, but not many. Okay, let's walk forward. Hang in there, Colorado. Okay, now we've got a couple states in the, I think that's Mississippi, West Virginia. Okay, over 20%. 4 years later, here we are. So Mississippi is still leading the pack. We got a new category now. Greater than 30% of the population in these states are obese. Okay, so here we are in 2010. Okay, this is 25 years. Okay, and for whatever reason, the colors in 2010 to 2015 are different, so I didn't put them up. But it's gotten worse. Okay, we're now in a new category, over 35%, and I said about a third of us now are obese, 2/3 overweight. The dramatic thing here, I think we need to recognize, this has happened during our lifetime. We have walked the planet for 2.5 million years, and it is within the last 50 years that this has happened. Our genes, our genetics, our DNA have not changed. Our code has not changed over the course of 50 years. So what has changed? It's the environment that we're exposing these genes to that has changed. And the environment is everything. It's called the exposome. It's the food we eat, and the water we drink, and the air we breathe, and the stress that's inflicted on us, and the toxins that we're exposed to, and the heavy metals. All those things contribute to this that didn't exist before. And it's not just the U.S. Dr. Park showed this slide earlier. You know, the rest of the world is on the same track. You know, we're leading the pack, but Asia and other countries are kind of right behind us. So I dove into the bowels of the CDC library, and this is what I came up with. They had data going back 2.5 million years. Now, the state lines may have changed just a little bit during that time. But this is what it looked like. So we got 2.5 million years to 1980, 1985 to now, and we saw what color maps those looked like. Okay, so something has happened, and it wasn't our DNA that changed. Okay, so we have to take a little step back to see how did we get here? You know, how is it that we are in the predicament we are now? Well, back in World War II, the GIs started to come home. And interestingly, they started to develop heart disease and heart attacks. And the government saw this and wanted to find out, well, what is going on? Why are all these men coming back from the war and having heart attacks? Well, there was a really smart guy. His name was Ansel Keys. And he was from all places, University of Minnesota. And Keys made a name for himself during the war. He developed the K rations after his last name. And he did some really cool starvation experiments. And he started to look at this, and he said, you know what, I got a theory. And I think all the guys over there in World War II, They weren't eating steak anymore. They weren't eating meat. And they came home, and over the next 5, 10 years, they all started getting heart attacks. So it's got to be something in the meat, the cholesterol, the saturated fat that's causing this problem. And he developed a theory, the diet heart hypothesis. And maybe some of you have heard of this theory before. Maybe you've heard it 2,000 times. Eating diets high in cholesterol and saturated fat leads to elevated serum cholesterol, which leads to plaque in the coronary arteries and heart disease. Pretty standard, conventional wisdom, right? Okay. And he based a lot of this on a huge study he did called the 7-country study. And he looked at a bunch of countries in in Europe, and a few in Asia, and then the US. And he had all this data and decided that he was going to use 7 countries and cohorts within those countries that fell right in line with his hypothesis. It was perfect. He had a nice graph showing as saturated fat went up, heart disease went up. Okay? Well, so this was big news, okay? Because the AHA and the AMA were on board at this early on. They had no opinion that actually, they had an opinion, but it wasn't that fat and cholesterol back then were a problem at all. Okay, so this is relatively new. Well, to every story and drama, there's an antagonist. And to Keyes, the antagonist was a guy by the name of John Yudkin. And Yudkin was a smart guy over in England. And he also was looking at the vets coming back from the war. And he said, it's not the fat. What's happened is they're coming home and they're starting to eat a lot of sugar. And it's the sugar that was known to be pro-inflammatory which was causing the problem. So they're coming back and having their heart attacks, but it's not due to the meat. It's due to the sugar. Well, these guys went head to head. And Keyes has a huge ego. And he just crushed any adversary in political debate. I mean, he just made him feel that big. So public debate hasn't really changed much over the course of the... All right, scratch that. Anyhow, so they went back, and Yudkin published this book in 1972, Pure, White, and Deadly, and it's a great read. And again, this goes back how many years? 40, 50 years? So this is nothing new. This was known way back then. And again, Keyes won the argument of the day, and Yudkin languished in obscurity, lost his job, lost his tenure, and it was an unfortunate sequence of events. But because of Keyes and his study and his results, this was during the Nixon administration, the McGovern Commission decided what was healthy for us. And based on this diet heart hypothesis, they decided that cholesterol and fat were indeed bad, and so began the low-fat, heart-healthy diet. We bet on the wrong horse. A fascinating account of this history, a woman by the name of Nina Teicholz, called The Big Fat Surprise. I highly encourage anybody who has an interest in how we got to this place. Great read. And she goes back and even interviews the people who are still alive with this whole McGovern Commission and Keyes' contemporaries and how we came to be. I encourage you to read it. So anyhow, this is what happened based on those recommendations. This is what we came out in 1980 food pyramid. And what is on the basis of that pyramid? 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates a day. Okay? And then you have fruits and vegetables kind of up, and then you had meat and a little dairy. And of course, the thing you wanted to avoid at the very top were fats and oils. Okay? So this was the recommendations of the day. And we did a pretty good job following it because they wanted us to decrease our fat intake from about 40 to 30%. And we did a pretty good job following that. So by 1980 or so, 1990, we got it down to about 40%. Okay, so 1980, here's where their first dietary guidelines started. And this is what happened with obesity. Now, we have to be a little cautious because when we look at these graphs, we're looking at correlations. This isn't necessarily causation, and we're going to talk about the difference between those in a bit. But we can see that the recommendations certainly didn't improve anything. Nothing went the wrong way. This is what sugar consumption did. Okay, back in 1815, we were eating 5 pounds, 5, of sugar per person per year. 3 years ago, we were eating 150 pounds of sugar per person per year. Our bodies cannot metabolize sugar like that at those amounts. The only thing we can do with it after our glycogen is filled up is to store it as fat. And that is what has happened. Okay, so 130, but this was back in 2012, so it's gotten worse. And sugar, unfortunately, isn't everything. It's not just the little sugar cubes and the little packets that we're pouring into our coffee. That's probably the least of the concerns. The sugar is hidden in everything. The condiments, salad dressings, yogurt. Yogurt's supposed to be good for you, right? Got probiotics. If you get yogurt, get it without anything in it. Just the plain yogurt. Add your own fruit. Okay? Fiber. Add the fiber. Okay? Otherwise, it's just another dessert. Frozen meals, ice cream. The list goes on and on. And we have many names for sugar. Okay, so they kind of are detracted with it because it's just not called sugar that, okay, well, it may not be so bad. It's all the same. Okay, so the American Heart Association came up with this heart healthy checkmark to help us decide what was healthy and what we should eat and what we shouldn't. And they get somewhere between $5,000 and $7,500 per endorsement, food endorsement. This is a money-making machine. And I don't mean to disparage the AHA. I mean, well, maybe I do. Anyhow, but there are some issues that I have with it, and one of them is this. Chocolate mousse attack. Okay? This has more sugar than a 16-ounce Pepsi. Got the heart-healthy check of approval because low fat. It's low fat. And that's not just chocolate mousse attack. This is many, many of the products that you will see on the cupboards. Okay, sugar addiction. Why is it so hard to get off this stuff? In small print, I apologize, but I just want to bring up the fact that sugar stimulates the same pleasure centers in our brain as opioids. That is why it's addictive. Okay? What happens is they've taken people who are on a high sugar diet and give them a drug called naloxone. And naloxone reverses the effects of opioids. Well, it does the same thing with people on a high sugar diet. They go through withdrawal. They put rats in a cage. On one side's cocaine, the other one's sugar. More often than not, they go to the sugar. It's addictive. It's hard to come off. Okay? That's why, and the food companies know this. I mean, this is a money-making machine because what happens when you take the fat out of the food, it tastes like cardboard. And you have to make it taste better. And how do we make it taste better? We do it with sugar. Okay. That's no lie. Okay, we talked about this a little bit earlier, thank you, Dr. Parks, about the glucose and fructose, and a string of them are then what is considered starch. Again, this is broken down into the simple glucose molecules and quickly absorbed. Okay, so let's just talk about glucose for a moment. The energy of life. Every single cell in our body can metabolize glucose. Okay? We eat it, and it bumps up insulin. And Dr. Parks made a very strong point of it. Insulin is the key. We have to control insulin. Insulin locks up energy in our fat. With insulin, you cannot break down the fat. You have to get insulin low to release the fat to start it burning. Okay, so it comes down to insulin. And how do we get insulin low? We got to bring down the sugar load. It does other things. The hormone leptin, that tells us our brain that we're full. Okay, sugar tells our brain we're full. That's why artificial sweeteners, they don't do that. So we take these artificial sweeteners, low fat, whatever it is, low sugar. Unfortunately, it doesn't tell our brain that we're full. At least sugar is telling it, our brain, that we're full, usually, if we're still insulin and leptin sensitive. Artificial sweeteners don't do that. So it's a misnomer to believe that you're going to lose weight eating and drinking low-fat or like non-sugared soft drinks. Sugar and fiber do a lot of nice things together, and that's the key. Take your fiber with your sugar, okay? Well, what has happened is the food companies have stripped a lot of the foods that we eat of their fiber, which causes the glucose to spike, which causes the insulin to spike, which locks up the fat, and we can't lose weight, okay? In nature, fructose-containing foods contain a lot more fiber than they do fructose. That's why you get a slower rise in that sugar level. Fiber speeds up intestinal motility, and there's a chemical in our intestine called PYY, which also tells our brains that we're full. So if you eat slow and give that food time to transit through your small bowel, it'll tell your brain that, hey, I'm full. But most of all, we will almost inhale our food, and within 5 minutes, we're pretty much done, and we haven't given the time for the stomach to distend to tell us we're full, or for the chemicals in the small bowel to tell us we're full. So all those messengers that would help us stop eating just aren't there. Fiber inhibits the absorption of the carbohydrate. Now, again, we want to get the carbs and the fats into the colon where the sugars can be fermented and then used to create good fatty acids. Again, with simple sugars, that doesn't happen. So we need that fiber to kind of help with the transit. Fast food is fiberless food. And finally, eat fiber with your sugar. Okay, and again, just a graph showing what happens when we have moderate sugar intake. Insulin goes up with it, and then it comes back down. But when we have these big sugar spikes, insulin goes well high, and then then the sugar drops, and it drops below baseline. And so now you get jittery, and you get that brain fog, and you get anxious. And how do you cure that? More sugar. So people are on this sine wave all day. You know, they trough and they peak, trough, peak. Okay, well, that's what we got to get rid of. We need a more linear, steady, gradual up and down, okay, and keep that insulin from spiking. Okay, so sugar. We need to limit how much we're eating. Okay, so if we're going to bring sugar down and carbohydrates down, okay, and protein we're going to bump up a little, not a lot. It's not going to be a massive change, but it will be an increase. The big change here is then we're going to have to bump up fat. We're going to have to pump up fat considerably. And what you need to wrap your brain and your mind around today is fat is your friend. Fat, and it's really unfortunate the terminology is the same. You know, fat in the food is equated the same as fat that we put on our bodies. They're totally different. It has the fat that you eat in the food has very little to do with putting on pounds because it all comes back to hormone regulation, as Dr. Park elicited earlier. It comes back down to insulin. And you saw this graph, I think, twice, but this is what we're talking about. This is what fats don't do. They don't ramp up blood sugar, and they don't ramp up insulin. Carbs do, and proteins are in between. The other problem with fats is they've all been kind of lumped into one big package as all fats are bad. And we know that's not the case anymore. And even conventional circles would agree that there are better fats and fats that aren't so good. And I think everybody agrees that monounsaturated fats are very healthy. We get those in olive oil and avocados and nuts. Polyunsaturated fats, those fats found, for instance, in freshwater fish, the omega-3s are really healthy. There's different types of polyunsaturated fats. The toxic ones are more omega-6. Now, they're both required or essential, but we get way, way too many of these omega-6 fatty acids that we get in industrial seed oils. So the safflower oils and the sunflower oils and the canola oils, you know, those have all been highly heated and some hydrogenated. I mean, these are all chemicals you do not want. And if you go back, this is what margarine was. And we were all told that was healthy about 40 years ago. Okay, well, they fortunately reversed their opinion on that, but that's kind of how nutritional science goes. You know, it's correct until I tell you it's not. You know, and so, you know, let's be wary of the recommendations. I don't say follow it. I say do not follow it blindly because a lot of these questions we simply still don't know. But a lot of things we do. And we know for sure that the trans fats and the industrial seed oils are highly inflammatory and those that we really want to avoid. Saturated fat. All right. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute too. But lard, tallow, butter, and dairy, that can be part and should be part of a healthy diet. Okay, now, the problem is saturated fat is frequently found in foods that aren't so healthy. If you're getting conventional beef that's given antibiotics and hormones and estrogen and given GMO corn and soy, you know, that may not be the best place to get your saturated fat. You know, there are other healthier choices that we can talk about. Okay, and just a chemical slide here. Saturated fat means all these bonds between the carbons are just single. Okay, that means it's solid at room temperature. So butter, lard, all that's solid. Unsaturated fats are the polyunsaturated fats, or the oils, and they have. This one is just showing one double bond. So what this would be monounsaturated. If you had a bunch of them, it would be poly. But what this does, it provides a kink in that chain, and this makes them liquid at room temperature. So now what has happened, though? So you have this one bond. So let's talk about this trans fat that you heard about. So this is a cis configuration. So it puts this bend in the chain. Okay, that makes it liquid at a room temperature. Okay, well, if saturated fat is bad for us, right, and we want to manufacture stuff that can sit on a shelf forever, we need it in a solid form, right? So what they do is they hydrogenate this. And what it does is it flips this configuration from this cis configuration to a trans configuration. Now it's straight, like a saturated fat, and now it can sit on a shelf forever and not go bad. Okay, so that's what a trans fat is. And those are truly the toxic. It may be the most toxic substance ever created for food. Trans fats are bad. And unfortunately, if you have 0.5% or less of trans fat in a food, you can still put it in there and say there's no trans fat. But there is code. There is code, and you can find out the code by looking at the list of ingredients. And if you see anything that says partially hydrogenated soybean or vegetable oil, that is code for trans fats. Put it back on the shelf and wipe your hands clean, get a little wiper, and leave it alone. Okay, so this debate, though, did not end with Keyes and the McGovern Commission coming up with this. There are all sorts of people who are furious that these recommendations went into play. They said there simply isn't the science out there to do this massive experiment on the U.S. population. And so you had a bunch of smart people looking into this. And I love this one. This is a guy by the name of Malcolm Kendrick, and he wrote a number of books. And he went back and looked at Keyes stuff. He goes, well, I'm going to do my own study. Instead of just 7 countries, I'm going to give you 14. And he went back and he looked at all these European countries, and this is what he found. The 7 countries that had the most saturated fat had the least amount of heart disease. And the 7 countries that ate the least amount of saturated fat had the most heart disease. It was completely opposite. Okay, and you may have heard about this French paradox. And the French paradox is the 2 people sitting on the sidewalk cafe with the tablecloth, right? And they're having their filet mignon with a little béarnaise sauce dribbled over the top and maybe a couple glasses of Bordeaux. And then, of course, they order the chocolate mousse dessert with heavy whipped cream. I mean, according to historical guidelines, they should have been keeling over left and right on the Champs-Élysées, right? I mean, but that didn't happen. If there's a French paradox, that means then there's also an Austrian and a Belgium and a Finland and Iceland and Netherlands and a Switzerland paradox, because they didn't get heart disease either, and they were eating a ton of saturated fat. So something was causing heart disease, but according to this, it wasn't saturated fat. Okay, but like I mentioned before, these are all epidemiologic studies. We are looking at relationships here. We're seeing this is what they're eating, this is their disease. Can we see a correlation? What we need to do to prove it, though, are evidence-based trials. Okay? We need to do the randomized controlled trial, the gold standard in medicine. And so what they did is they decided finally, okay, we are going to do a massive research project. Does fat really cause heart disease? And they took 49,000 women with similar characteristics, about the same age, and then divided them up into 2 groups. They had the control group, and then they had a group who were put on low fat. And they followed them for 8 years. Okay, so finally we're having a study that's going to prove once and for all, does fat cause heart disease or breast cancer, for instance? And the conclusions, there was no relationship. But the problem was, the people who ran this study, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, were so convinced that it was the fat and the cholesterol that was the problem that they didn't believe the results. Okay, there had to be something wrong with this study. Okay, either the control group weren't a very good control group, and they saw that, everybody else is supposed to be in low fat, and they just changed their diet even though they were supposed to do anything. Or the low fat group, the test group, they just didn't eat enough low fat. They didn't get it down low enough. Or 8 years wasn't long enough. This needed to be longer. Or the statistical analysis was just incorrect. We just looked at it wrong. But anyhow, so after all this, most expensive study ever funded at the time by government, they decided to dismiss the results. Okay, so this wasn't the end of it, though, although it was the biggest one looking specifically at that issue. So in 2010, this really got the cardiologists' pulse racing here. They looked at 347 subjects in a meta-analysis. And this is where we take a bunch of different studies that have been designed correctly, and we pool the data to come up with even more significantly powered information, ones that we can kind of hang our hat on. Yes, okay, this is good information. This is what they came up with. Okay, no relationship. Okay, 2015. The Cochrane Group is a group of scientists that are probably the most independent group looking at medical literature and the accuracy of the studies. They're not funded by the big food companies. They're not funded by pharmaceutical companies. It's as pure science as you can get. And this was their conclusion when they looked at these relationships. This was just a few years ago, okay? Really not much relationship at all. Okay, next one. British Medical Journal. This is probably the most prestigious, along with Lancet in Britain, as far as medical journals go. This is what they came up with. Okay, and then this was just last year. Okay, 2017. Okay, so it does make you pause. Well, wait a minute. I thought we were told saturated fat is really, really bad for us. But if we're going to embrace a low-carb, high-fat diet, we have to embrace fat. We have to recognize that fat is not the enemy, fat is our friend. It's going to allow us to diminish that insulin spike that sugar is causing. Okay, but what about cholesterol? Okay, you talk about saturated fat, but what about cholesterol? Cholesterol's still got to be bad. I mean, we hear this still every day, right? We have to lower our cholesterol. Well, cholesterol is not a fat. It's a steroid alcohol. It is in every cell of our body. We have to have cholesterol to manufacture cells. And we have to have cholesterol to repair damaged cells. Every cell wall has cholesterol. And that includes damaged arteries. So if you have a damaged artery, including a damaged coronary artery, it has become inflamed or damaged, okay? We need to fix that. And how do we fix it? Well, plaque is deposited, right? Okay, so when we see a plaque in a vessel, cholesterol is in it. Well, of course it's in it. It has to be in it. That's how we repair damaged cells when we develop a scar. Lots of cholesterol in there, okay? So it's like blaming the firemen for the fire. Every time there's a fire, the firemen are there, right? So it's got to be them starting the fire. Well, not really. Okay, it's required for steroid synthesis. All of our sex hormones require cholesterol. Vitamin D, which every one of you are deficient in, by the way. If you haven't been tested, please get tested, because it's critical on so many levels. And unless you're living south of Atlanta and not using a bunch of sunscreen, we're not converting that cholesterol in our skin to healthy vitamin D. So I would strongly suggest getting tested, and you probably need to be on a vitamin D supplement. Take it with fat, because vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and if you're just taking it by itself, you're just going to eliminate it. And I see this every day when I'm imaging. All these pills are sitting down in the rectum. You just rented your vitamins. That was it. Okay. Component of myelin. Okay. This is required for proper nerve conduction and our memory. And now many of you are probably on cholesterol-lowering agents, probably statins. And they're good for some people, a small amount of people, but most people I would have issue with. Don't come off your statins, though, until you talk to your doctor. But I will tell you, there are much better ways to address your cholesterol first. Maybe statins are needed at the end of the day, but there's a lot of things we can look at before then. And what happens when the cholesterol has dropped, we need that for a proper memory. So in the elderly in particularly, who are frequently put on these medications, their memory starts to slip. And gee, I just can't remember. And gee, Grandpa and Uncle Joe, they're just not kind of white with it. But what I have seen happen many, many, many times, and there's books out this, so you ring about the statins, and the clarity comes back. It doesn't happen all the time, but it might be worth trying if, that's a possibility that, will need to be addressed by your doctor. But that's something to consider. And actually, there's a book called by David Graveline, who was a former NASA astronaut, called Lipitor, Thief of Memory. And he had 2 huge episodes of transient global amnesia, and thousands of people wrote in their own case reports on memory problems that they had with this stuff. So statins may be good, but there's some issues with it that have to be recognized and be cautious with. Component of bile, essential for fats. We need cholesterol to digest fats. So cholesterol is a critical element. And driving it down as low as possible may not necessarily be the best way to go. Disorders that raise cholesterol. Some of these were discussed by Dr. Parks. But this is where I would suggest that we start. What is causing cholesterol to be elevated in the first place? If we can address that, perhaps we don't need the medication. And we think that inflammation now is probably the driving force with all chronic disease, not just heart disease, with cancer and with autoimmune disease and with arthritis. We're all in this chronic inflammatory state based on not only poor food choices, but the way we live our lives now. Okay, stress and adrenal disorders, we talked about that. Diabetes, obesity, low thyroid function. Correct the thyroid function, cholesterol comes back to normal. Heavy metal toxicity. We're probably being exposed to too much arsenic. Rice, you're eating a lot of rice, got a lot of arsenic in it. Cadmium in the soils. You know, we're putting chemicals and herbicides on our soil. It's being absorbed into the plants we eat. Mercury. By the way, if you guys got mercury or silver fillings, it ain't silver. It is mercury. And it's been really good studies showing that, you know, being exposed to a low dose of mercury your whole lifetime isn't a good thing. It's right next to your brain. So you might want to consider getting the mercury amalgams removed and getting different ones placed in there. So if we treat that, though, cholesterol comes down. So how about we look at these things first? Okay, and then if the cholesterol is still high, then we have to ask, well, is that such a bad thing? Or isn't it? Well, this is, now you're going to say, okay, this guy's really nuts. Is he putting this high cholesterol and healthy slide really up here? Well, yeah, I am actually. Framingham study, most probably famous epidemiologic study ever performed, this is what they found. The higher the cholesterol in the elderly, the greater the health benefit, the lower the mortality. They lived longer, and they were healthier. If you are a man or a woman at age 69 with high cholesterol, there's no proof that taking a statin will reduce your risk of having a heart attack or death. Okay, but what about the rest of us? If we're not 69 yet, if we're in the younger crew. Well, the science is pretty good. If you are a middle-aged man and you've had a heart attack, a statin can protect you. It'll protect you from having another heart attack, and it will also prevent you from dying early. You will live longer, and that's what we're all really looking for, right? Not only to decrease morbidity, but actually to live longer. If it decreases my risk for a heart attack, but I'm going to die of something else, and on my death certificate it's going to be the same date, was it really worth being on this every day for the rest of my life with all the potential complications that could be associated with it? So there's a number of things that I think we need to take into the context of this medication. For some people, it's important. And again, I want to stress, do not come off your medication if you're on it. But these are questions perhaps you could raise with your provider about looking at some of those other causes that we looked at, and maybe addressing those would allow for you to come or taper down on the medication you're on. The lower the cholesterol level, the greater the risk of infection and cancer. This is really cool. You know, for 2.5 million years, why we died was either trauma or infection. LDL, the evil LDL, that is a wonderful antimicrobial. Okay, that kills bugs. So we wanted high LDL for most of human existence. It was only recently where it became demonized that we wanted to drive it down as low as we could. Okay, and then finally with cholesterol, two big reports. In 2013, American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology came out with this. And again, you may have treat to target. And they had LDL of 130 was the target. And if you had higher risk for heart disease, they wanted under 100. And if you had really high risk, they wanted under 70. Okay? And this went on for decades, treat to target. Absolutely, this was proven. This was proven. This is what we need to do. 2013, they threw it away because there was never enough science, number one, to convince it. Number two, you were having people with normal LDL levels. Half the people with normal LDL levels were having heart attacks. And they were convinced that we were missing these people who were at higher risk for heart disease. So they came up with a new Framingham calculator. And what this looks at is a number of things. It looks at your age and your gender. If you're hypertensive, high blood pressure. It looks at your HDL and your triglycerides. If you smoke, diabetes, and it comes up with a number. Well, if that number is over 7.5% over a 10-year period, you are now a candidate for therapy. So if you were an executive at Merck and Pfizer, you were celebrating. I mean, they broke out the champagne, the beluga caviar came out, and they were toasting each other. Are you kidding? Overnight, 13 million people just became diseased and qualified for medication. Really? Okay. So now, so the calculator has been looked at many times. The first one was by this really smart guy from Harvard called Berger. And he estimated that this new calculator overestimated a risk between 75 and 150%. It's way overtreating. Another analysis I didn't put up in 2015 came up with the same thing. Just clearly overtreating. If they were overtreating based on a simple number alone, and they didn't look at all the other risk factors, this was too high. And I ran this. At age 66, with 0 risk factors, you were a candidate for therapy. Just age alone. So, and then 2015, this was interesting. Did anybody hear about this one? In 2015, they removed the cholesterol recommendations in food. Had it been the other way, this would have been trumpeted in the major journals and newspapers, Channel 5. No, they got rid of this because there was never any proof that the cholesterol we eat in food has any bearing on the cholesterol that we find in our bloodstream. Think about this. Ansel Keys, even the godfather of all this, said unless you're a rabbit or a chicken, cholesterol in your food really has no bearing on cholesterol in your bloodstream. So they got rid of it. American Heart Association, USDA, guidelines, they got rid of it. Okay, so, I haven't made too much of this stuff up. It's all there. So anybody who wants to research this. So amazing, right? Okay, so now, but the cholesterol in our blood, though, was still an issue, this whole LDL thing. And saturated fat, they still haven't left off the hook. But amazing, despite all the research I just showed you, this is where we still are. And now I had a tough time with this slide, I have to admit, because I didn't know if Vader should be LDL or saturated fat. But the emperor, the saturated fat is supposed to bump up LDL, and so, he is the dark. Well, he's not the Dark Lord. That's Harry Potter, right? Oh, scratch that. But Voldemort could have been saturated fat too. But anyhow, so here we are still today with this concept of health. But what we really need to do is be whacking sugar. Okay, and this concept isn't something new. You go back to the mid-1800s, Banting was a patient of this William Harvey, and they started to look at this letter on corpulence. And he found that if he cut out the sugar, saccharine matter, starch, beer, milk, and he cut out butter, that he could lose a lot of weight. And so he wrote this book, and a lot of people followed this for many, many years. Okay, Atkins, this guy, he caused a firestorm in the midst of the heyday of his low-fat, heart-healthy diet theory. This is what he came out with. And they dragged this guy's butt into a congressional hearing to explain himself, because this was completely contradictory to what they were trying to profess in their USDA pyramid guidelines. And now more recently, pediatric endocrinologist called Robert Lustig, and this guy, really smart guy, and he's looking at the pediatric population. And we showed that slide before with Dr. Parks, where infants are now being born obese and diabetic. They're not choosing to be sloths and eating too much and not exercising enough. I mean, this is a metabolic disaster that we are passing on to our kids. And then Tim Noakes from South Africa. I would highly encourage you to watch Sugar the Bitter Truth. It's a podcast. It's wonderful, and it goes all through the whole history of fructose in particular and how toxic that is. Fructose, as we mentioned before, can only be metabolized by the liver. Sugar can metabolize everything else, so it's particularly toxic to the liver. High fructose corn syrup, of course, is where we find in soda pop. So that's why drinking soda pop is particularly harmful on the liver, and we're going to look at that a little more in depth in the next talk. So some general guidelines. So if we're going to take sugar out of the equation, and again, we're all starting in different places in our lives. We're not going to eliminate all this stuff. We all understand that. But if you can take steps in the right direction, okay, and keep taking those steps, that's where we want to go. So we're not going to eliminate any of this stuff tomorrow or the next day. But if we can get going in the right direction, that's really where we're going to need to be, okay? So 80% of your body composition is determined by diet. And the misnomer is if I exercise a lot, I'm going to lose a lot of weight. It's just not going to happen. I can eat 3,000 calories in 5 minutes. It'll take me all day to burn that off. So you cannot exercise your way out of a lousy diet. Exercise is critical on many levels. The biggest one is it makes our muscles insulin sensitive. Okay, it's good for balance. It's good for our memory and cognition and many other reasons. But as far as weight loss, exercise doesn't really help a lot. What happens when you exercise a lot? I get hungry, right? So you eat. So again, diet is key. We're going to lose. Diet is key, and controlling our metabolism and our insulin is key. Lean body mass, again, critical. Macronutrient composition and quality of the calories is important, much more so than number of calories for the most part. A calorie is simply not a calorie. You wouldn't think you'd have to really stress that. I mean, we know that a calorie of a Mars bar is probably not the same as a calorie in broccoli, okay? They just do completely different things in our system. But, if you look at the number of calories in those things, they said, well, if 4 calories here equals 4 calories there. Not the case. And controlling insulin is key. So we're going to eat food, real food. Any label should be considered a warning label, not necessarily an information label, a warning label. Okay, it's telling you what is in there. Anything with more than 3 ingredients, think about putting back. Real food doesn't have labels. Okay, the periphery of the grocery store is where we want to stay. Okay, we're going to markedly reduce the sugar intake. Local, if you can buy local, a little hard up here, but when possible, food loses its nutritional value the further it goes. Okay? And then it's usually brought on ship, it's heated, refrigerated trucks, and it sits who knows how long on the grocery shelves. So just something to be aware of. Organic, I would really stress organic for a few reasons. Number one is that it just doesn't have the pesticides and the herbicides. That's the big thing. People can argue, well, does it have more nutrients than conventional? It depends on what soil is grown in. Unfortunately, most of the soil has now been stripped, and they're putting all sorts of anhydrous ammonia and chemicals and so forth to replete the soils that we grow our food in. So it doesn't have the magnesium and the calcium and the selenium and all those other minerals that used to be in our grandfathers' and great-grandfather's garden. It just doesn't have that mass-produced food. So it depends on where it's coming from. And I love this one. Never buy your food and gas at the same place. I just have to, Michael Pollan, and I have to share a quick story. So I was going up to Ely, of all places. This was a couple years ago, and I was hungry, and we were stopping at the gas station for gas. And I was going to go in there, but I committed that I was only going to buy real food. So I walked up and down those aisles, walking, looking. Finally, I found a bag of almonds. Now, they had salt in it, but that was okay, but I got the almonds. So I kept looking. Well, there was nothing left in the whole store to eat, but this was a bait shop. And I went to the back of the bait shop, and there was a tub of minnows. So, almonds, minnows. I mean, it was a critical decision. Well, I went with the almonds. But I challenge you, the next time you stop in at a gas station and go in, see if you can find any real food. Sometimes they'll have a banana here and there or an apple. It's tough. It's not. I would advocate going to the grocery store, the farmer's market for your food, not the gas station. Quit drinking your calories. That is a big one. Okay, we get way too many calories in the drinks in our drinks. Most of them, again, high fructose corn syrup, soda pop. We're going to be talking more about this in the next one too, but fructose in particular is very damaging. Shop the periphery. Aisles of stores have just food mines everywhere. So stay out of there as best you can. Partially hydrogenated soybean oil is code for trans fats. And then this whole concept of healthy whole grains. And thank you, Dr. Parks, for touching on this on the last one. We think that, you got the white sponge. We know that's probably not so good. But what about the healthy whole grains? It's got all the grains in there. It hasn't been stripped of the bran and the germ. Isn't that healthier? Well, yeah, the bran is. It's got some fiber in it. But it doesn't really reduce a whole lot the degree by which it causes an insulin spike. And in some ways, bread has more surface area when ingested than actually table sugar. And your blood sugar will spike even quicker eating refined white bread than it will table sugar. So bread is not a healthy option, unfortunately. I know, but there are some low-carb options that are out there, and I think that's a good place to start. And rather than eating those, get the low-carb tortillas and other options. Okay, what diets work? Well, of course, the one you can stick to. Okay, but in reality, there's two things that pretty much every diet that works have in common. They have low sugar and they have high fiber. Okay, they got the carbs connected, the fiber connected to the sugar, and controlling that insulin is key. Okay, we're going to increase our protein. Again, it's important on where is that protein coming from. We'll talk about that in just a second, but this is why they work. Protein is more satiating, as it's fat compared to carbs. Okay, it increases your fat content, it reduces sugar, combines it with the fiber, it depletes that glycogen, and the big thing, it lowers insulin, so now we're able to start burning our stored fat. That's the biggie. We can start using fat for energy rather than sugar. Increases nutrient density and reduces the caloric density, and again, eliminates the most fattening foods. Fat does not make you fat. Fat is your friend. Excess sugar makes you fat. Okay, so if we're going to look at somebody's lab values that has followed this approach, what do we get? Well, your blood sugar improves. Your hemoglobin A1C, which is a longer-term test for sugar control, improves. Total cholesterol, we just talked about. Most people don't have a big effect in their cholesterol based on this. There are hyper-responders, and that's a few percentage of us out there, that we do bump up both cholesterol and negative LDL. Okay, that can happen, but that's in the vast minority of us. Most of us, this is what happens. We really don't see a significant change in our total cholesterol level. LDL might increase, the evil LDL, but again, Dr. Parks commented on this, LDL isn't just one thing. There's a spectrum of LDL particles. And the problem is most doctors, when they order your cholesterol profile, they only order the standard test. They don't order this particle test that actually will tell you what your cardiac risk truly is. You start needing to look at those the LDL particles, and the reason you get a lot of LDL particles is because your triglycerides are too high. Okay, so you need more of those lipoprotein carriers to ferry around the cholesterol in your bloodstream and the triglycerides. So if you drop the triglycerides, those LDL particle number can come down. So ask for that particle number the next time you go in and get tested because it's really useful information. Your LPA, that's more of an inherited marker, but one of the few things that can drop LPA is saturated fat. HDL will go up. There are a lot of things that drive HDL up, but saturated fat can do that. Triglycerides will definitely come down. When you get rid of the refined carbs, triglycerides should follow, and they almost always do. The CRP and homocysteine, those are just two inflammatory markers. Those tend to also improve. So this is the panel that I've seen most of the time when people come on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet. Almost all their biomarkers improve. Okay, the ratios, again, we're going to go from that 60% carbs that we saw on the USDA pyramid down to 30. Okay, protein, we're going to let sneak up a little bit, and we're really going to bump up our protein content. Okay? Now, again, the more we get under 100, the more low carb we do. For some of you, you may be at 400 or 500 carbs right now. So if you can get down to 100, 150, that's a massive improvement. So that's why I say it's modest carb reduction, but for some, that's going to be a huge carb reduction. Okay, so I don't want to diminish that at all. We're, again, all taking small steps, and this whole concept of biochemical individuality needs to be stressed. What happens to you and what happens to you is going to be different than what happens to him. With the same biomarkers, the same numbers. If you change your diet one way, he changes it the identical way, and the markers are going to be different. And weight loss is going to be different. So we all have our own genetic predisposition to things that we're going to eat and be predisposed to. That being said, this works for about 95% of us, okay? So yes, we are unique, but the general concepts still apply. Okay, so we're going to really focus in on the vegetables and fruit. I just listed a number of the lower glycemic. And low glycemic, all that means is that it raises your blood sugar a little slower than some of the other high glycemic fruits and vegetables. Okay, so these are ones we want to focus on, and berries and fruit. And people say, well, you should eat more fruits and vegetables. I would like to say eat more vegetables and fruit. Now, it's just semantics, but the emphasis should indeed be on the veggies. Okay, fruits have fiber, okay? So they that fiber keeps the blood sugar from climbing too quickly. But again, there's still fructose in there. So if we're eating a ton of fruit, we can still bump up that fructose level a fair bit. And I always say, do not drink your juice. You should, eat it, okay? And, don't drink your fruit. Did I get that right? Eat your fruit, yes. And the reason is a lot of the fruit juice has been stripped of the pulp or whatever, and it's just like soda pop. Fruit juice is pretty much no healthier than soda pop for the most part. Some of it has a little vitamin C. They've added a few things, but for the most part, it's still spiking your blood sugar just like soda pop does. So juice is not a particularly healthy option. Okay, so lots of color, a lot of phytonutrients. We want to really focus on those. Okay, a word about fruits and vegetables, though. There's something called the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15, put out by the Environmental Working Group. You can Google this. And if you're going to buy organic, and it tends to be more expensive, of course, so we want to watch our budget. If you can't buy the Dirty Dozen organically, you may not want to buy them at all because they've been so heavily sprayed with chemicals that you kind of lose the health benefit. And I think strawberries came in at number 1 for the last 4 or 5 years. If you can't buy organic strawberries, I would suggest don't buy them at all, okay? Okay, clean 15. These are ones that you don't have to buy organic and tend to be pretty healthy because the chemicals they use either aren't absorbed or they don't need them to grow these things. Okay, so carbs to avoid, we kind of talked about this already. Anything refined, processed, manufactured, if it's got a label, think twice about it. Okay, bread. And again, this is a killer for most people because they love their bread. But, small steps. Okay, go to the lower carb options. Again, there is no such thing as an essential grain. Grains started about 10,000 years ago. We walked the planet for most of our existence without grains. This is a relatively new thing. And then again, we can get most of the antioxidants and other nutritional elements through other foods than bread. And again, I talked about the bump up in sugar and insulin based on eating refined breads. Okay, healthy fats. Okay, and again, monounsaturated fat, the omega-3s we talked about, kind of cutting back down those industrial seed oils, the omega-6s. Saturated fat is a component of this. Okay, all right, butter. You're seeing butter up there. Yeah. Now, some people, if you're active dairy products, so some of those are proteins in their whey and casein, you can eat something called ghee, and that has the proteins taken out of it, but it's still a good fat. Again, the ones we want to avoid, these industrial seed oils, all the corn and soybean, again, they've all been, treated with GMO on top of hydrogenation, so ones to avoid. Okay, they're healthy protein. Again, remember, what you eat, ate. What you eat, ate, if it's an animal, right? They were fed something. What were they fed? Because that's what you're getting fed. Okay, so if they were fed corn and soybeans that were grown with, all the pesticides and the herbicides and the glyphosate and the Roundup, okay, there's a lot of interesting data coming out on this. They keep telling us, Monsanto keeps telling us, oh, there's nothing wrong with glyphosate. I don't know if I trust Monsanto. So be careful because that's what a lot of the animals are being fed. Even the pastured animals, they're grass-fed, but then they're finished with corn. And I love a great steak. And to be honest, I am a sinner. I'm up here professing all this, but I actually had a cookie earlier this week, by the way. And this thing it was a ginger cookie, and I went in, and this thing looked like a Frisbee. I mean, it was that big. And next to it was a smaller one. So I'm going, and I had my latte, and I broke down, and I said, okay, I have to tell the people at the conference that I had a ginger cookie. But but reality, nobody's pure, and we just do our best, okay? And I don't always eat grass-fed meat. My wife is very religious about it, and she buys it all, but sometimes I just want a really nice steak that has been grass-fed but it's finished with the corn because I actually prefer the taste better. The grass-fed stuff, I think, you need to acquire that taste, but it's far healthier. So I would say 3/4 of the time we're eating purely grass-fed stuff. The other time we're not. We're all trying to do our best. And I would say when you have the option, get grass-fed. And then same with the fish. The farmed fish is not healthy. They are feeding these fish, same kind of stuff, corn and soybeans. As a matter of fact, the salmon that's manufactured in the farmed cages comes out white. So then they have to add coloring to get them to turn pink. So it looks good when we buy it. So if you can, buy the wild stuff. And actually, canned salmon's pretty good. If they can the canned wild salmon, it's cheaper, and it stays in your pantry or refrigerator. Get that. And with the bones is good. You don't want to perforate your esophagus, but the tiny bones have a lot of calcium in it, so it's a nice calcium supplement. Okay. Get a fast food. Okay. So why is it so bad? Well, of all the things we've already talked about today. Okay. And with the bottom line, and let's take the lowly French fry, if we could, for just a second. So now you've taken a potato and you've stripped it for all it's worth. The germ's gone, the brand's gone. All you got is pure carbohydrate. So now you put it in the deep fry. Okay. And who knows how long that's been sitting at McDonald's? I mean, that's been there for a day, a week. Oh, who knows? And that becomes rancid. So now you put in a zzz and you zap that baby. Okay. Now it comes out, and now of course you have to put the salt on it. So you got a ton of salt, and to finish it off, it goes in high fructose corn syrup ketchup. And who doesn't love a French fry? I mean, it's like God's playing this dirty joke on us. All these things that taste good are so terribly bad for us. Okay, but the French fry is particularly toxic. So be careful with the French fries. Dang, huh? Okay, what to avoid? Again, stuff, potatoes, pasta, rice, bread. Dr. Berger, you're killing me. This is everything I'm eating. But the things we need to be very aware of and cut back on. We talked about soda and juice are about the same thing. What we want to eat on a low-carb diet, and we talk about this, meats, we have to introduce those fats and the oils. That's where we're going to get a lot of our calories. And that's where we're going to have insulin dropping so we can burn that fat. Vegetables. Cheese. Well, this looks kind of boring. Well, again, this is what we're emphasizing here. It should be water. Bring a thing of water to your work or wherever you go and get rid of the plastic. The plastic bottles all got phthalates and BPA, all that's absorbed into the plastic. You don't need any more BPA in your system. So get yourself a stainless steel container, fill it up with some good water, and drink out of that. Tea, coffee are okay. Again, alcohol, there's some good data that shows alcohol in moderation is actually quite healthy. Okay, decreased risk of heart disease. But that moderation is a very loose term for everybody. Basically, they say you're drinking less than your doctor, you're okay. But I know a lot of doctors, and you ain't okay if you're going with that. Okay. Alcohol, again, 2 ounces, beers in between, and then distilled spirits, unfortunately, they have a lot of chemicals and contaminants. And I would just say be cautious with that. Okay, chocolate. Finally, something you guys can jump into with this diet, right? Yes. All right. It doesn't all have to be miserable. But it's got to be chocolate with higher cocoa content, okay? Milk chocolate is just sugar. Milk chocolate is sugar. 70% or higher. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. Theobromine, it drops your blood pressure. People can significantly decrease their blood pressure with higher levels of chocolate. Okay. And again, it's not eating 3 candy bars, though. But people sometimes find, though, if the 70 or 80% chocolate, you only want a couple pieces. Okay, so this low-carb spectrum, again, I would even say this liberal low-carb. Let's take this even out, maybe a little higher just for those people who are kind of starting out with this whole concept. And getting ketogenic, we talked about that earlier, that has been shown to be really effective for people with seizures or epileptics. A couple cancers actually respond pretty well to a ketogenic diet, but I think it's really hard for most people to go long-term on a ketogenic diet. It's just challenging. And I don't think you need to do that in order to achieve exceptional health. I think we can bump up the good carbs. And again, when we say this low carb, high fat, those low carbs we're talking about are healthy carbs. Okay? So it's now we're eliminating all carbs. We're putting carbs in there with got all the fiber. Okay? And all those comes back to insulin. Let's control the insulin. Okay, so we flipped the pyramid. Okay, so we had 6 to 11 servings to begin with. Okay, this is where grains are showing up now. The spots where fats used to be. Okay, on the bottom we got a ton of vegetables. We got the proteins, low sugar fruits, nuts, some dairy. Again, some people respond to dairy. I don't think we need dairy for the most part. The casein and whey are good proteins for most. As we get older, we all become a little more lactose intolerant, and so a lot of us just don't digest that sugar within milk so well. Matter of fact, most Asians, they're born lactose intolerant, and they never even drink milk, or at least cow milk. Anyhow, so 2 things. So food is software. Food is input. Food is helping direct our genes, okay? Are you going to have those genes manufacture healthy, nourishing proteins, or are you going to go the other way? Are you going to be manufacturing inflammatory proteins that make us sick? Okay, and it's a decision we make each time we eat. And it's empowering. It's empowering because we have control. You have control of what you put in your mouth. One of the few things we have control, right? And I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying we can make that the choice each time we have dinner. And finally, what Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine. So I think we'll stop here, take a break.